So, Chapter 3 of Medulo has leaked, and it's a fun one. I would say out of all of the chapters we've got of Medulo, this is probably the least serious one, as Chapter 1 dealt with children being kidnapped and sold onto the black market for their cursed energy, Chapter 2 introduced a Sukuna-esque character, and Chapter 3 introduced the man shark. But while the chapter is not nearly as serious as chapter 1 or 2, a lot of important things happen in this chapter. See, it's important to remember that there is an overarching threat of alien invasion throughout the entirety of this story, and solidifying a relationship between the Sumerians and the humans through the bridge of Tsurugi and Yuka is paramount in making sure that the superior fighting force of the Sumerians isn't pointed at humanity. And therefore, while chapter 3 is a bit unserious at times, it does a really good job of using humor to address the overarching themes that we're tackling in this story, specifically progressing the relationship between Tsurugi and Malu, while also giving us a peek behind the curtain of how Malu's powers work, bringing us one step closer to possibly understanding the origins of cursed energy. So while it wasn't a crazy chapter by any means, it is an important one. So I'm excited to tell you all about it, because today we're talking Chapter 3 of Medulo Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the one-on-one fights, and Sasuke's getting his chakra sucked. So, Chapter 3 opens with the new Team Gojo, which is Usami, Tsurugi, Yuka, and Malu, walking through a high-speed rail train station. And Usami is telling Tsurugi, Yuka, and Malu that today their mission will be an extermination mission. Now, this perplexes Yuka, who says, but aren't exterminations usually the job of the government? Which I find to be a very interesting comment, because it implies that because they are Jujutsu high students and not full-fledged sorcerers, that they're never sent on missions where exterminating a cursed spirit is the object. Now, it's not the craziest concept of all time, but we see multiple times in the original JJK timeline, while Team Gojo are still very much considered students, and they're sent to investigate cursed spirits that could obviously lead to extermination scenarios. In fact, the literal first mission they're ever sent on, they're thrown into a building and told to exterminate a cursed spirit, and all Yuji is given is a cursed tool. But anyways, Tsurugi kicks into the conversation and says, is there any reason for sorcerers to be sticking their nose into this extermination mission? Which I also find curious, because if they're talking about an extermination and it's not a cursed spirit, are they just implying that the government is usually in charge of killing people or things? I guess if it's things like animals, that makes sense. It's important to note here that I'm reading a fan translation. Nick, read the official translation. I do, when it comes out. But anyways, Usami lets everybody know that the site of the extermination is Gifu. Now, for those of you who don't know, Gifu is, let's call it, a suburb of Nagoya, which is south of Tokyo, but north of Osaka. Now, this confuses Yuka, and Tsurugi says, well, now that you mention it, I remember hearing a story about a shark that swam upstream in Gifu. Now, I have absolutely no idea what this could possibly be in reference to. Nagoya and Gifu are mountainous areas. There's literally no way a shark could swim all the way upriver and get to Gifu. But Usami tells Tsurugi and Yuka, no, this isn't about the shark that swam up the river. This is about a shark who swims through the forests, telling the team of young up-and-coming sorcerers and an alien that essentially they're being sent hours south outside of Tokyo to exterminate a shark that is seemingly swimming through the forests. And naturally, as the idea of a shark swimming through forests is ridiculous, it's therefore the easiest possible assumption to make that that shark is a cursed spirit. Now, on the next page, we see Yuka, Tsurugi, and Malu all on the bullet train, or the Shinkansen. And Tsurugi is looking at Malu with disgust in his eyes, thinking about the conversation he had with Cross at the end of Chapter 2, where Cross told him not to speak to him. However, because Tsurugi doesn't understand that Malu has a twin brother in Cross, Tsurugi believes that that was Malu who essentially told him to shoo away from him. And thus, as this is seemingly the first time that Tsurugi has seen Malu since that event, he's upset with him. But still, he starts the conversation in the bullet train to provide some exposition for us, the readers, as he says that cursed spirits only appear in Tokyo. Now, this is interesting, because as we know, that's not true. At least in the original JJK timeline, that is not true. Yes, highly populated areas like Tokyo had the highest density of cursed spirits. And because they had the highest density of cursed spirits, they had the strongest cursed spirits. But we know people like Nobara, who lived all the way out in the sticks, still fought against cursed spirits out there in the boonies. And while cursed spirits popped up way more rarely out in the countryside where Nobara lived, there was still cursed spirits. On top of this, there was branches of Jujutsu High outside of Tokyo, like Kyoto, where Toji, Mekamaru, Mai, and all the other sorcerers went went. But what Tsurugi is telling us right now is that cursed spirits now only pop up in Tokyo, which is actually a lie that the Jujutsu Society had told the population of Japan decades ago, 68 years ago to be exact, because the Culling Games and the Shibuya incident and the battle in Shinjuku against Sukuna all made it impossible for the Jujutsu higher-ups to lie to the Japanese population about the existence of cursed spirits. And thus, in order to continue the lie and to make sure that the Japanese populace doesn't freak out over the idea that cursed spirits are literally everywhere, they told Japan that cursed spirits are an anomaly that only occurs in Tokyo. However, it appears as though they were literally faking it until they could make it, because now that lie has become reality. Now, after Tsurugi drops this insane piece of information on us, Malu says, "Cursed spirits?" To which Tsurugi snarkily snaps back at him by saying, "Oh, so it's cool to talk to me today," which confuses Malu because he wasn't there to have that conversation with Tsurugi on the roof. But Tsurugi continues on by saying, "Wait, how don't you understand? You guys are able to use Jujutsu as well, right?" Now, at this point that you could get sick of these two not understanding each other, as she goes on to describe to Malu how cursed energy works in Japan, about how the people of Japan leak out cursed energy, and that leaked out cursed energy accumulates, and how all yokai and strange phenomenon start with the idea of accumulated cursed energy. But then Tsurugi adds some additional context to that very interesting comment about the idea of cursed spirits only popping up in Tokyo, when he says that exterminations of these abnormal beings, or cursed spirits, haven't occurred anywhere outside of the supernatural wasteland of Tokyo for the past several decades. However, the moment that aliens appear, now cursed spirits are popping up outside of Tokyo, essentially blaming what they believe to be the first instance of a cursed spirit outside of Tokyo in decades on the existence of the aliens now on Earth. But this comment does give us some additional context to the idea that cursed spirits no longer exist anywhere but Tokyo, as apparently the change was not immediate. And in just the past couple of decades, which might sound like a lot of time, but I'd like to remind all of you it's been 68 years since the Culling Games, have cursed spirits become extinct from all other parts of Japan. Now, Malu doesn't necessarily understand this accusation that Tsurugi's throwing at him, so he goes, "Huh?" At which point Yuka once again steps in, because these two are Olympians when it comes to misunderstanding each other, as she tells Malu that Tsurugi and possibly some of the others in the Jujutsu Society believe that the identity of this cursed spirit now out there in Gifu could be that of an alien. Now, this idea that humanity believes that the aliens may be responsible for a man-eater out in Gifu rocks Malu, as he loses the ability to talk for a second. But he gets it back almost immediately, as he says there's no way we could be responsible for this. And upon seeing Malu's incensed attitude about the idea of the aliens being responsible for this man-eater, Yuka rather snarkily says, I guess it must be the aliens then. She then calms the situation down, something that she's seemingly very good at, by saying, "Malu, you're just like Usami, right? You have reasons you can't tell us all the information you would like to. Maybe you're not a bad person after all." That is to say that Yuka understands that Malu is put in a very unique situation here. He understands the sentiment of the aliens and how they're most likely leaning towards conquest rather than cohabitation, which is hampering his ability to connect with humans because he's being told not to give too much information to humans because there might be a war between the two of them, but he believes that his connection to humans is the only way to avoid conquest, which he actively does not want. So he's vying for peace as essentially the diplomatic liaison of the Smurians, with his emotional hands tied behind his back. We then flash forward and Team Usami has made it to Gifu. And the narrator, or somebody who's talking to Team Usami, says that there have been 2 victims of the man-eater and 3 witnesses that have seen a shark at the scene. However, the idea of seeing a shark here makes no sense because there's no sources of water nearby. But yet the bodies of the victims were torn apart, like a shark had bitten into them multiple times. But because of the ridiculous nature of these deaths and the idea of a shark swimming through forests eating people, Team Usami interviews the 3 witnesses, who range from unsure about what they actually saw, to children, to borderline blind old people, and therefore not the most reliable witnesses. And thus they all decide to split up, with Yuka going to interview the witnesses a little bit more, and Malu and Tsurugi going to investigate the places where the people were eaten. And thus on the beginning of page 4, we see Yuka rather exasperatingly talking to Tsurugi using some kind of mind phone, as Yuka is telling Tsurugi that the witnesses are saying they might have misseen what they thought they saw, and that the autopsy report is saying that the bite marks found on all the victims aren't conducive with shark bites. And thus Yuka's gonna go and try and find all of the witnesses and get their story straight. And thus Tsurugi sighs as he hangs up his, wrist phone, and before even taking a beat to talk to Malu about what he believes might be going on with the man-eater, he turns to Malu and says, "Behind the scenes, the aliens are planning an invasion of humanity, aren't they? Can you tell me if the aliens are truly about to invade or not?" Now, rather naturally, this catches Malu way by surprise, as he turns to Tsurugi and says, says, what do you mean by that? As he goes on to explain how he believes that even though the aliens might be pacifistic right now, that they're planning to invade Earth. And considering the fact that that is exactly what they're doing, we see Malu starting to freak out as he thinks to himself, I'm here right now specifically to avoid that outcome, as Malu is actively working with Jujutsu High students to try and figure out how sorcery works on Earth and to figure out if humans are worth cohabitating with. But rather than telling Tsurugi that, because he can't tell Tsurugi that, Malu takes the offensive, pointing his finger while yelling at Tsurugi and saying, do you humans even have the rationale or the morality to talk about us aliens? Implying that humans are too morally bankrupt to accuse the aliens of planning anything even remotely revolving around an invasion, because if humans had the chance, they would have wiped out the aliens days ago. That pisses Tsurugi off as he says, you guys came here uninvited, and you got a lot to say for an uninvited guest. And it's this point that Malu says something interesting, as he says, I didn't do it because I wanted to. Now this could mean a lot of things, obviously. Malu could be saying that maybe he didn't want to stop at Earth and he wanted to stop at some other planet. Malu could be saying that he didn't want to have to be the one to be in charge of cooperating with humanity. Or maybe he could be saying, and this is what I do believe he's saying, is that he didn't want to have to leave his own planet. So we've been trying to speculate why these 50,000 Sumerians left their planet if they're designated as a Sukuna level threat. What force could have forced them off their planet? Is there some bigger bad that they lost to that they're now fleeing from? Did their planet run out of resources? Are these 50,000 Sumerians outcasts from the rest of the larger population of the Sumerians? There's infinite possibilities. However, what Malu is saying right here does seem to tell us that at least he, but most likely the majority of the other Sumerians, kind of wish they weren't on Earth right now, implying that they were most likely forced off their home planet, and thus kind of eliminating the idea that the Sumerians are on some kind of nomadic conquest, trying to take over every single planet they stop by, and that their self-reporting of being refugees might actually be more accurate than humanity is giving them credit for. Now Malu continues on by saying, you're trying to treat me like a little brother. What do you think, I'm an idiot? But it's this point that Tsurugi lets his true grievance air, as he lets Malu know that he's actually upset with him because Malu waited so long to use his third eye Jujutsu ability to save that little boy from the child's kidnapper. But Malu says, I've explained that a million times already. I had orders from my higher-ups telling me to not only not expose how my abilities work, but also to not interfere with your mission. But Tsurugi, knowing that, says, I don't care about that. Do those orders really matter more than the life and safety of a child? And thus we get to the true meat of why Tsurugi is upset with Malu, because Tsurugi believes that Malu prioritized his orders over the possible death of a child. And this kind of clocks Malu. We then cut to a gigantic double spread as their argument is cut short by a shark swimming out of the bushes, and the two of them scream as they look upon the Great White. Now Tsurugi immediately takes a defensive stance and grabs for his katana, telling Malu to stand back, but Malu says, if you use your cursed tool here, won't you start a wildfire? Because for those of you who don't remember, Tsurugi's blade lights on fire by using the sparks that are made when it's unsheathed to allow Tsurugi to launch vicious flame-based sword attacks whenever he uses his katana. And thus if he was to use his katana in this dense wooded area, he would start a wildfire. And it's at this point Tsurugi should say, I didn't ask how big the room is, I said cast fireball. But he doesn't do that because he's responsible. He then turns to Malu and says, well then can't you do something, you useless fool? Malu simply yells back, what are you talking about? But in order to make sure that the man-eating shark didn't get away, Malu jumps over to it and tackles it, or at least holds on to it. And as he holds on to it, as it swims away from Tsurugi, he yells back at Tsurugi, can't you use your katana without lighting it on fire? And Tsurugi yells back at him to not underestimate him. However, before Tsurugi is able to unsheath his no longer flaming sword, Malu realizes that the shark has a face, and not the regular shark face, it has a face in its stomach, and it's the face of an old man. That's right, the shark that swims through the forest is just the guy in a huge shark suit. And thus Malu screams at the top of his lungs, an old man. And thus the old man begins to yell at the two of them and says, I'm not an old man, I'm still young. Which is a sentiment I feel every single day. But this old man, who's maybe naked under the shark suit, begins to ask Malu and Tsurugi what they, as Jujutsu High students, are doing all the way out here in the countryside. And thus Tsurugi asks him how he knows that they're Jujutsu High students. And it's at this point that the man, who's wearing a shark suit and running around the countryside, lets them know that he himself is a graduate of Jujutsu High. And it's this point that Malu lets the old man know, whose name is later revealed as Nagata, that they were sent here on an extermination mission. And therefore Malu asks Nagata if he knows anything about a man-eater in these parts. Specifically, a man-eating shark. At which point Nagata lets them know that he could never eat a human, and all he's basically eating nowadays is beer and snacks, which is probably worse for you than cannibalism, but still. Nagata then introduces himself to Malu and Tsurugi, saying, "Hi, I'm Nagata, former sorcerer. Turned, apparently, Shark Man." And apparently the man-eater in this area is not him, the shark, but rather a tiger. A tiger by the name of Torinosuke. And apparently Nagata is going after Torinosuke, which is why he's dressed as a shark. I mean, he never says that, but one has to infer. Now this throws Tsurugi for a loop, because Tsurugi didn't believe that there were still wild tigers in Japan, and Malu doesn't even know what a tiger is. But apparently, according to Nagata, there's a story from a quarter century ago that a pair of tigers was brought in by illegal foreign traders, but they got away, so they decided to settle in these mountains. And through inbreeding, because there was only a pair of them, eventually Torinosuke was born, and he is their grandchild. Nagata then goes on to talk about how he's known Torinosuke's entire life, and how Torinosuke has always been an incredibly clever tiger. And how the two of them, just by looking into each other's eyes, could always understand what the other was trying to say. So Torinosuke and Nagata are actually very close, at least according to Nagata. And apparently in recent years, a myriad of different things have been happening, like a massive solar project near the summit of the mountains breaking down, and the local river drying up because it's getting hotter, have caused the supernatural or possibly cursed spirits to come back to the area. On top of this, when the river dried up, the local ecosystem collapsed, and thus Torinosuke had to come down from the mountains to look for a water source, but when it did come down from the mountains, it ran into humans, and thus it attacked humans, and now it's been labeled as the man-eater. And thus all the villagers who have seen a shark at the site of all of these man-eating incidents have actually just seen Nagata trying to take down Torinosuke. And thus Tsurugi, after hearing the story, lets Nagata know that he wants to help, but it's complicated. But Nagata lets Tsurugi know that he doesn't want to kill Torinosuke. He wants to help him. But Tsurugi draws a line in the sand immediately and says any animal that's killed a human needs to be exterminated, especially if that animal has gotten a taste for human meat. But Nagata, forever the green ally, says, "I understand the situation. However, the only reason that Torinosuke ever ran into humans is because we drove Torinosuke out of the mountains. So now we're the reason that Torinosuke attacked humans, and for human reasons, we want to kill Torinosuke. That doesn't seem fair." He then goes on to say that his house is pretty far away from the village because he doesn't get along with all the other villagers. And it's like, yeah, you're running around naked in a shark suit. I think I might be on the villager side. But anyways, Nagata essentially pleads with Tsurugi to allow him to take care of Torinosuke, saying that he's a sorcerer and therefore he's powerful and he can keep an eye on one or two tigers. But Tsurugi says there's no way we could possibly allow that. But Nagata says, well, if you're worried about the natural ecosystem of this area, then Torinosuke's grandparents should have been exterminated decades ago. I've chosen the path of coexistence with Torinosuke, and I'm not going to stray from that. And this causes something to click in Malu's head as he thinks to himself, coexistence. See, this is why I'm saying that while this chapter may not seem all that important, it pushes forward the narrative, because in the beginning of this chapter, Tsurugi and Malu are arguing, as Tsurugi feels that the aliens are going to invade, and the two of them don't trust each other, mostly because they're bound by their own higher-ups to not reveal too much information to each other. However, coexistence requires open cooperation, and while it can be bloody and mistakes can be made in the heat of the moment, in order for two species to coexist where one is more powerful than the other, in the case of a tiger being more powerful than humans, commitment to coexistence is a battle fought on both sides, and it has to be a perpetual commitment. Now Nagata continues on by saying, please, I'll do anything, just let me save the tiger. Tsurugi says, no, if the tiger kills another person, what are you gonna do? At which point Nagata says, well, what would you want me to do? Commit seppuku or something? But Tsurugi does not fold, as he says, listen, you spilling your guts or using your guts to try and keep a tiger under wraps isn't gonna matter to the families of the victims. But before the conversation can go any further, Nagata picks up on a scent of blood, which is most likely got something to do with the fact that he's actively cosplaying a shark. And as he beelines away from Tsurugi and Malu, he says, you're over there, aren't you, Torinosuke? I can smell blood from far away. But as the shark man gets to the location of the scent of blood, he realizes that it was a trap. Torinosuke is waiting behind him, high up in a tree, as he thinks to himself, ah, yes, you've always been clever, Torinosuke. As Torinosuke jumps down from the tree and slashes at Nagata, a should-be fatal slash that he's barely able to dodge just enough to make sure that it doesn't kill him. Now Tsurugi and Malu fly into the fight to try and ensure that Nagata doesn't die, as Tsurugi throws a shoulder into Torinosuke, sending him flying. And it's this moment that it's important to note that Tsurugi wants to be just like Maki. The fact that he's able to launch a 400 to 500 pound tiger should not surprise you. Now after beginning to face up against Torinosuke, Malu screams at Tsurugi to wait. But Nagata says, no, It's fine. And it's in this moment that Malu realizes that Nagata understands that Torinosuke needs to be killed. But before Torinosuke can be cut down, we get a flashback to how Nagata and Torinosuke met, which is apparently while Torinosuke was still a pup. But Torinosuke lost his mother when he was very young, and thus Nagata is consoling him, saying, listen, I'm alone too. I'm sorry, I wish your mother was still here, but that's what parents do. They die before we're ready for them to die. Loneliness isn't necessarily all bad. It'll make you stronger. But if you're ever feeling too lonely, you can come to me whenever. And thus we see as Nagata thinks to himself that he wished that Torinosuke had come back to see him, but he never did. And that it was in the moment that he stumbled upon the first victim of Torinosuke that he realized that the old Torinosuke was long gone. On the next page, we see the now bloodied Nagata crying relentlessly as he thinks to himself, at the very least, please die without suffering. Please, Torinosuke, I beg you. And we see Torinosuke in the next panel bearing down on Tsurugi, who's pulling his katana. And on the next page, Torinosuke is gone, and Nagata is no longer a shark man, as Nagata apologizes to Tsurugi saying, I'm sorry I made you take on that role. But Tsurugi says, it's fine, it's my job, which makes Nagata simply say, you truly are a sorcerer. Now Tsurugi then walks away from Nagata as he realizes that Malu is sitting by himself in contemplative thought. And as Tsurugi begins to walk up to Malu, he says his name, at which point Malu, unprompted, says, our role is to see if we can cohabitate with humans. That's what I was sent here to do. And my technique, his third eye technique, is something I share with my younger twin brother, and therefore I'm prohibited from using it, and I'm only permitted to use it in the worst of emergencies. Now all Tsurugi really locks in on this is the fact that Malu has a twin brother, and therefore most likely the person who told him off was his twin brother, and thus Tsurugi now understands that it wasn't Malu who was mad at him. Now on the next page, Malu continues as he explains that if he uses his power in a big way, it'll be passed on to his younger brother. Now I'm not entirely sure what this means, but Malu is saying that he shares his third eye blasting power with his younger brother. And there's a possibility that the weight of this power is something that Malu is trying to bear by himself. See, it's important to note that the aliens have identified that their power system works similarly to that of Jujutsu on Earth. Because that, we can assume that twins probably operate with the same principles. That is to say that any and all power that one of the twins would have had, they now share with each other because they're considered the same in the eye of Jujutsu. This is why Maki didn't get truly powerful until Mai died, and like maybe why Sukuna's dead twin brother kept reincarnating. But anyways, what Malu seems to be saying is that if he continually uses his ability, eventually Cross will get access to it. And for some reason, that's a bad thing. I don't know why, but it is. Anyways, Malu continues on by saying, if a situation arose where I needed to use my powers, I was afraid that the reveal of my powers might worsen my relationship with humans. That's why I hesitated, not because I was underselling the importance of the life of a child. And yet, he apologizes. Now, Tsurugi by this point has already sat down next to Malu, and he's asking him if he's sure he should be telling him all this information. To which Malu says, no, I probably shouldn't be, and therefore I'd appreciate if he kept it secret. And thus Tsurugi asks him, well, then what made you want to tell me? And thus Malu tells him that he simply wants to get along. Malu continues on the next page and says, us and the tiger, we may be similar. However, we have the ability to communicate with words. And if we have the ability to communicate with words, I want to use every single word available to myself to express myself, to make sure that we never have to reach the conclusion that happened for that tiger. Before the conversation can go any further, a baby tiger waddles out of the bush. And Tsurugi immediately stands up, grabs his katana, and says, so you were there. Now Malu yells at him, seriously? You're gonna kill this baby? And Nagata comes out of nowhere and says, wait! And Tsurugi, who's apparently got a heart under all that cold exterior, grabs the baby up by the scruff of its neck and hands it to Nagata, saying, this time, don't take your eyes off it. And Nagata, with tears in his eyes, takes the tiger pup and says, okay, and hugs it while crying. And thus the last page of the chapter focuses on Tsurugi and Malu walking away from Nagata, as Malu asks Tsurugi if that's okay. To which Tsurugi says, we can't know. What'll happen to that guy is an unknown. And honestly, the same goes for us. And Malu, with a gigantic smile on his face, says, you're right. Establishing that while the two of them may not know what the future is going to look like for humans and Cimmerians, as long as they do what they believe to be right, it feels right in their heart should lead them to their best possible future. With the last panel of chapter 3 of Majulo, we see that Yuka is being hassled by some old ladies who she's probably supposed to be interviewing, but they're just giving her tea and food and telling her that she looks just like they looked when they were young. And thus chapter 3 of Majulo has come to a close. And honestly, well, the chapter was not as crazy as previous chapters, chapters, it is well written. A complex and interesting story is being told with classic JJK humor. There's nuance and action, and while the action is kind of silly, it tells a good story. And thus, I'm very happy with this chapter, but I'm curious to hear what your guys' thoughts on this chapter is. Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, this lady needs a walk, and no, that's not Neutron.